everyone. We're here to talk about Prometheus platform monitoring within PCF. My name's Alan Strader. This is Jamie Christian. We're both from Northern Trust. Northern Trust is a financial services company that was founded just over 125 years ago with the primary focus on wealth management and corporate and institutional services. What we want to talk a little bit about today is monitoring solutions that we looked at, what were some of the options that we considered, why we ended up with Prometheus, and how we have Prometheus running on Cloud Foundry. Jamie will get into some discussions about alerting and dashboarding and things where we specifically use Prometheus and its data on a regular basis. So we're pretty new to this journey. We stood up our first foundations for real use in January of 2017. We had our first applications go live in March of 2017. We found that we weren't actually able to get the data that we wanted about the platform with the tools that we currently had. They were having problems interpreting stuff coming out of the fire hose and being able to determine what it actually applied to rather than just a single IP address. So around June of this year, we started down the road with Prometheus. In our environment right now, we have approximately 750 microservices. We have 4 full-time and 2 part-time resources as platform operators. We've got a little over 250 developers doing Spring Boot applications at the moment. So Prometheus was the Greek god that delivered fire to man. Prometheus is also an open source monitoring solution that originally developed by SoundCloud that shows the fires in Cloud Foundry to man. Quite often it shows us the fires that we didn't even know existed. It's pretty straightforward in the way it's laid out. Prometheus is a time series data store that also does alerting and the data collection from bosh and PCF. There is an alert manager that takes and sends notifications from Prometheus via email and Slack. We have a web interface that's used via Grafana to give us a single point of entry for Prometheus Alert Manager in Grafana. When we started looking at items, they were comparing commercial solutions and various other things. So we wanted to take a look and see what with Prometheus, we had a higher upfront cost in soft dollars because it was a fairly steep learning curve because we were trying to pick up information on both Cloud Foundry, bosh, Prometheus, and a number of other things all at the same time since this was a completely new environment for all of us. And when we were looking at the estimated ongoing costs, we figure it will be significantly cheaper than some of the commercial solutions because there's no actual recurring hard dollar costs that we have to pay on a monthly or annual basis for this service at this point in time. So for us to roll this out, it took us a little bit to get it started up and running because we were trying to figure out what was actually happening. But using the bosh deployment the way it is, once we got something figured out and configured, it was easy to roll out to the other environments. Did I skip a slide? No. Okay, I'll just go back. All right, so I thought we would have the environment slides, but that's fine. But so what I was saying, it was easy to do the upgrades. We've done 4 deployments in each of our 5 foundations. So since June, we've rolled out 20 different deployments of the Prometheus and Grafana combination. So I think that the time value proposition was greatly improved because we were able to leverage an initial bosh deployment and some initial dashboards that were created by other members of the Cloud Foundry community. When we started looking at this, we were not looking at it for an application monitoring solution. We use CA's APM product for doing the application monitoring, but we're looking at it for more of the platform, and for us it was sort of get a view into what was a bunch of black boxes at the time. The other thing where we use it is we primarily are looking at it for capacity and performance reporting and alerting to tell us when we're running into issues and also to be able to collect the data over time so we can use it for forecasting for increases in hardware. Several things that we looked at. We spent some time looking at Datadog, Sysdig, Pandora, FMS, Prometheus, and a handful of other things. The various things that we use as criteria were cost, where there was actual hard dollars versus soft dollars, whether it was already in use at Northern Trust, because we wanted to give preference to things that were already in-house and we didn't have to bring in something new. Commercial versus open source was one of the considerations we wanted to look at from a support perspective, whether data was stored on premises or off premises. So our security team was not comfortable with us going with an off-premise solution, at least initially. We got recommendations from various community members and vendors. We looked at ease of use and sort of the look and feel. Can we get the data that we want in our dashboards and so forth? Sort of where it all shook out with Prometheus, the benefits were there was no actual hard dollar cost up front for us to get it up and running, nor to have it as an ongoing basis. There was an existing bosh deployment that we were able to leverage for our initial deployments, and they had existing dashboards that we could use to start getting some data relatively quickly to see what was going on in the environment. We didn't have to start from absolutely nothing and build it up, so yay for all the support that we got from the various members of the Cloud Foundry community. Some of the limitations we ran into is being an open source project, there is no direct support for it, so if anything happens, we sort of have to figure it out on our own. The documentation, there's a lot of documentation, but in my opinion, it's somewhat fragmented. So I spent maybe 15 minutes trying to find a setting or a configuration option I needed, but I may spend the next 6 hours trying to figure out where I actually needed to apply that setting to have it take effect. It just didn't seem to have real good continuity in the documentation that way. The startup and operational learning curve was pretty steep, but once we have got our heads around how things worked and so forth, it's been rolling pretty smoothly. There's a few features that we think are missing in the product suite, but Jamie will talk a little bit more about those coming up. Within the bosh deployment, we have 5 components. There's Prometheus itself, which is the time series data store, and it does its own alerting. There's exporters, which are like little third-party applications that actually harvest data from the various components, such as bosh, PCF itself, the Diego cells, a number of different things, and exposes those for ingestion into Prometheus. Nginx is set up as a reverse proxy, so again, you have a single point of entry, and you don't have to continually connect to different hosts for different components of the system. Grafana is used for dashboarding and presentation of metrics. And then Alertmanager takes the alerts that come up in Prometheus and it will send out notifications. There's, I think, about a half a dozen different services that you can use for that. The ones that we currently employ are email and Slack. So in Northern Trust, our current environment, we have 5 foundations set up in 2 different data centers. We have 3 non-production and 2 production. The production are in the different data centers. And right now we have a separate implementation of Prometheus in each one of the foundations, which makes it a little cumbersome to go out and look at the individual things for comparison. What we're going to be moving to next is sort of a set of complete redundancy. We'll have each of the foundations in each of our data centers, but we will be using a shared implementation of Prometheus for a single point of entry to see everything in one point for our non-prod environment, and then another shared implementation to where we'll be able to see the things within our production environment. Installation of Prometheus initially was pretty simple. There's a number of artifacts we had to download from GitHub. There's the instructions out on GitHub as well. There's a handful of credentials you have to create in the various UAAs for bosh and Cloud Foundry and some MySQL users in the databases. The manifest file that has to be populated with foundation and network specific information for each deployment, and then it's deployed through bosh. There currently is a tile that's available for this. It's not supported by anybody. It's part of an open source contribution back. But when we first started down this road, that tile didn't exist, and the tile concept itself seems to be more geared toward being foundation specific. It doesn't really look like it's going to fit well into our shared implementation vision going into next year. So for alerting in Prometheus, Prometheus has rule-based alerting, but the alerting is sort of, what's the state right now? You can see things that are not in an alert state, that are in an alert state, or pending an alert state because of a timer, but there's no historical information to look at that over time, and there's also no way to do notifications. And that's where Alertmanager comes in. That's our solution for doing notifications from Prometheus, so we know when something's there. We don't have to sit and watch the displays all the time. And with the notifications from Alert Manager, it also sends summarized notifications. So if we say have 10 applications that are all having the same issue, instead of sending out 10 notifications, it'll send out one notification, but it'll tell you in reference back that there were 10 different applications that were having issues at that point in time. Or instead of applications, if you say maybe the Go routers, but it does summarize them. And so we get deduplication and grouping. Another thing that it allows us to do is we can take and set up rules for routing specific alerts to different receivers. So maybe team A wants their messages to come in through Slack, and then team B wants their stuff to come in through a specific email address. Those can be handled that way. We also use Alert Manager so we can sort of stop noisy alerts. If we're getting something that keeps recurring and we're working on it, we can turn those notifications off for a period of time while we're actually investigating. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Jamie. She's going to continue with alerting.
Thanks. Okay, so as Alan mentioned, we are using a bosh release that was pre-existing for our Prometheus deployment. So because of that, there were a bunch of alerts that were already built in out of the box, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So customization is key in this case, and the customization for Prometheus alerts are very simple. So for one example, we've had app teams come to us and ask, how can I get an alert if my application goes down? A very reasonable request. So we've started looking into this with Prometheus, and you can see an example of a custom alert up here. It all goes into one file, the custom.rules file, so any custom alerts will be all in one place. What you should pay attention to here is that if block at the top. That is our condition statement that will trigger the alert. So in this case, we're counting how many application instances exist for the application called show-env. If the number of applications application instances are ever less than 2 for 30 seconds, then that alert will be triggered. Another thing to pay attention to here is that annotations block. The details there, the very first part of it, is what kind of gives value to your alert, and that is important because out of the box, notifications look like this. It's just a bunch of labels, GUIDs, maybe an org name or a space name, but it's not really just a readable sentence. You won't get much value out of that just by looking at it at a glance. So that when you add that details block, you can have it say whatever you want, and in a pinch, you can look at it pretty quickly and know what's going on. You can also customize the routes, as Alan mentioned before. So in this example, we'd be able to set up a new receiver to one team's specific Slack channel or a email distribution group. And then we could route a specific alert name to always go just to that team so that we're not crowding all of our Slack channels with somebody else's alerts that we might not care as much about. One thing that we needed to modify a little bit in addition to those optional customizations was the URL that is embedded in all of those notifications. So out of the box, the URL is just the host name of that Alert Manager VM, which is only accessible from that VM. It's not a generally available URL. So we had to go in and modify that. It was very simple so that we can send it to a generally available URL. When you click on it, it'll take you to the Alert Manager user interface. And this was one of those cases, as Alan mentioned before, where the customization was really easy, but it took us a long time to figure out where that should go. So that for future reference, if any of you use that, it's in the Alert Manager control file, and it's just that one line at the bottom, the web external URL. One concern that we currently have with Alert Manager is that there's not really any authentication wrapped around it. So if you have the URL, you can see it. And any application team who goes to the Alert Manager user interface can see all the alerts out there, not just the ones for their team. So for that reason, we haven't implemented it yet for application team use. It's only for our platform team. One thing about Prometheus is that it provides a lot of information. So because of that learning curve that Alan was talking about, we needed to learn what those metrics meant, and a lot of them were not obvious. So one example of that is on this page. You can see at the top there is a Grafana dashboard, and then at the bottom you might recognize as the Apps Manager user interface. So in this case, they're both referencing org quotas. And you might notice that for the shared services one, the percentage used of the org quota is different between Apps Manager and Grafana. And that was kind of a mystery to us for a second. We had to go and look into that, and what we discovered was that it wasn't showing us what we thought it was. Grafana was showing us what's actually being used within that org, whereas Apps Manager is just showing us what's reserved for those applications when they were pushed. So that's a discovery that was actually really good for us, because it helps us now to help application teams use their resources more wisely, so that when we get requests that say, hey, our org quota is full, we need to increase it, we can go and investigate and make sure that we do in fact need to increase it, or maybe we can revamp how we're using our resources a little bit. Another dashboard or metric deciphering problem that we had was there are various graphs that are called instances. So in this example, you'll see on the left is the Apps Manager user interface. And then on the right, there are two different instances graphs. One comes from the System Apps dashboard, and one comes from the Space Summary dashboard. They are all showing us reserved resources and not actual values, and they're just showing it slightly differently in each one. For us, this wasn't very useful. We're not really interested at this moment in time in what our reserved resources are. We just want to know what's actually out there. So this is a case where we decided to use dashboarding to change them and present things that actually mattered for us. So now what we have is on the top left, we created one graph that has all the instance information for a particular space. And we do still have that requested value up at the top, which right now we might not be using, but if we ever decided we wanted to use instance quotas, we'd be able to see how much of that quota is being used by that requested number. And in addition to that, in Grafana, you can't drill down into your dashboards. So you might look at that crashed value on the top left and see that I have 2 crashed apps, but I can't go click on that and see what they are. So we then added another graph where we can drill down, or makeshift drill down, and see what those problem applications are. There are plenty of dashboards that we loved out of the box and required no modification. So here are some that we look at regularly to help us better manage the platform. One of those use cases is the CF Sales Capacity dashboard. So prior to when we implemented this monitoring solution, we used to get ServiceNow tickets from our automated deployments if they failed, and it would just say, hey, your deployment failed, and we didn't know why. So we would have to go and do some investigation. We might look at the application memory limit and see if that was being reached, the org memory quota, ERT memory status, and eventually we would probably increase our Diego cells and realize we're filling up on capacity really quickly. But now, because we have this monitoring solution, we can be a lot more proactive versus reactive, and we can set up alerts so that we get a notification when our cells are low on resources or total available memory, rather than having failures and then going and fixing it reactively. Another use case, in one scenario, we were getting alerts for low storage from Prometheus. So we went into the Grafana dashboards to see what was allocated versus available, and we were sort of surprised by what we were seeing for our total cell disk. Why were we seeing 32 gigabytes available or total when our template was actually assigning 64 gigabytes? And what we learned is that we needed to learn more. So this is just how swap is allocated by bosh, and we didn't totally understand that because we hadn't needed to look into it before, but it allowed us to have a learning opportunity, and we now know what configuration is needed to increase our actual usable storage on Diego cells. One other case would be when we upgrade our build packs we would like to know what teams are using what build pack so that if we're going to go and get rid of one, we can figure out who's using it and how we can move on to the next one. And finally, the MySQL table statistics. At one point in time, we had an upgrade issue where we were trying to upgrade ERT and we kept seeing that we couldn't push Apps Manager. And we opened a support ticket and we spent a couple hours on it trying to figure out why this wasn't working. And what we came down to is that there was an upgrade on the bug. There was a bug in one of the upgrades from a previous version. And basically I think daily app config usages table had over 1 million rows in it, and it wasn't being truncated automatically. So we had to go and truncate that ourselves. And in order to get to those MySQL tables, we had to go to our jump box, then SSH to Apps Manager, then set the deployment, then target and log into MySQL, then set the table, and then we can finally read the table size and decide if we need to truncate it, which we had to do prior to every upgrade to make sure we didn't have to fix that table issue. And now we can just go into a dashboard and see how big it is and see if it's an issue. So that makes that a lot faster for those upgrade processes that can already be pretty long. There is plenty that we love about the product, but there's some things that we would like to see improved. One of those would be the drilling down into dashboards that I mentioned. Another would be maybe some sort of config server so that any changes that we make don't require a redeploy, or any changes that we make to the current deployment don't get wiped away every time we do an upgrade. So if we had a config server-like thing, say for alerts, we could then go in and add a new custom alert and it would automatically be read and we wouldn't have to submit a new deployment or worry about it getting wiped away. Another would be integration with an enterprise ticketing system. So right now, as we said, we're just dealing with things from our Slack alerts and our email alerts. What would be nice is some integration with like ServiceNow or Smarts in Charge so that we can actually assign these things and get them routed to the correct teams to get resolved. Another would be searchable dashboards. So right now we're using almost 70 dashboards, and some of them are very similar, but not entirely the same. So I might be looking for something that I saw in passing at one point in time, and I'm searching through all these dashboards trying to figure out where I found it. And we can only see search on the dashboard name and not necessarily the contents of that dashboard. So having that searchable would make things a lot easier for us. We also currently can only look at metrics based on out-of-the-box services. So things like Autoscaler and RabbitMQ and Redis. But we use user-provided services all the time for things like Eureka and for binding to our CA-APM agent. And we haven't yet found a way to query for user-provided services and get metrics on those. And then finally, as I mentioned before, the Alert Manager security. Right now, we can't use it to its fullest potential just because there's no authentication wrapped around that. Overall, we're very happy with Prometheus, and we definitely recommend it to other people. It provided a lot of data for us in very little time, and we think we can improve upon that by customizing the data further to better fit our needs. Our experiences with customization have been very good so far, relatively easy and easy to replicate across multiple foundations. And while it took us a while to understand the product just because of our own learning curve and the data that was being collected, that learning curve was made worth it by the agility and operational control that we now have using this product. So for people who will be viewing this online, here are some references that were helpful for us as we were implementing Prometheus, and a few sessions related to monitoring and metrics on PCF. At this point, we're happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Sure. How do we know that Prometheus itself is running? Who monitors the monitor?
In the current implementation, we don't. It's really, we know when we go in and look to see what's there. In the plan for the shared implementation, it will actually, the plan is we'll have multiple instances that will then monitor each other.
Good question. Yeah. Cool. Learning experiences for us. So that the alert manager URL that we had to go in and customize is actually a bosh property that we can fix. Yes.
How does the data get stored in Prometheus? Is it through a firehose?
No, there's a component that is called exporters. They're actually little standalone apps. So there is one that scrapes data from the fire hose to bring it in, but they actually, so there's other ones that go out and look at the bosh metrics. There's one for MySQL, there's one for Rabbit. So it actually has these little agents that collect from various different places. The part I liked about it is the agents don't actually have to be deployed on the individual VMs. For the most part, they're actually run externally. There is another component that we do deploy as a bosh add-on called the node exporter, which gets us machine level metrics for the VMs.
So you didn't look into like the bosh border, which can then stream all metrics to like the fire hose?
Yeah, we actually did use the bosh forwarder when we were trying some of the other solutions to get stuff off the fire hose and from syslog. But this has, we actually, within the Prometheus bosh release, there actually came with an exporter for bosh that it scrapes it and it's already there. We don't need to run the bosh exporter in parallel with it.
Okay, so this was just packaged with Prometheus.
Yeah, there's a total, I think there was 17 exporters that were available. And we're using, I think, 5. Correct, yeah. And basically the way the exporters work is they are a separate little standalone process that gets started up by default on the Prometheus server. It harvests the data. That's part of the configuration you're going to do during the deployment. It harvests the data. It makes it available on an HTML page that Prometheus goes out and scrapes at regular intervals.
Can you restate those questions so we can hear them?
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was where the data comes from, and if we had used the bosh forwarder to get the data. Yes.
Just a clarification with regards to your architecture, did you deploy Prometheus with the same bosh that you deployed PCF, or is it standalone bosh deployed Prometheus and then your foundations are supporting that?
So the question was, how did we deploy? Which version? Where did we use bosh? It was what we were using for Cloud Foundry. We have a separate implementation. We're using the same implementation that we're using for the rest of Cloud Foundry. When we started down this road, though, we actually set up a separate network for our own managed services that we deploy outside of Cloud Foundry, which pretty much now manages and runs in parallel with the on-demand service network. And that's how we use it for the same type of deployments. But we do have a separate network we use for our manually managed. One of the downsides to that is every time we do an upgrade, we need to go back and touch the deployment so that it shows back up in the cloud config.
Do you have multiple foundations reporting into that centralized Prometheus, or is it just one-to-one relationship?
Today, it's a one-to-one relationship. Once we stand up the rest of our other foundations at the beginning of next year, we're actually going to be moving to a shared implementation. So all of our non-production hosts will be reporting back to a single implementation for non-production, and then the same thing for production.
One follow-up. Do you plan on separating out from the PCF bosh when you do that, or do you plan on the same bosh?
That's still in discussion. We don't have a good answer to that. There's a couple things that we've been in discussions with our folks from Pivotal, and some things want us to stay with the one deployment, and other things that want us to go to a separate deployment. I think it's going to have more to do with the other things that go into that network and how we expand its use.
Cool.
There is a software department available that can deploy either the PCF bosh or SpringOne bosh.
Yes.
It just one architecture.
And the piece, that pipeline is URLs up on that, on the reference slide.
Okay.
If
And with
anybody's looking
that,
for it.
we are out of time, so thank you all for good questions and being a great audience. Enjoy your lunch.